We got a lot to cover this evening and a lot of folks here in person. So I think we'll go ahead and begin. I am just going to open tonight with a quick welcome to and a thank you to all of you for being here this evening for our panel discussion, Moose Management and Ancient Ecology in the Southern Rockies. This event is hosted, graciously hosted by the Center of the American West. And I want to extend a special thank you to our panelists, many of whom traveled in from afar for the evening, one of whom is joining us via Zoom amidst an illness here and would have liked to be here in person. So there's tremendously thankful to all of you who drove in here this evening to be with us, whether you're a local here to Estes or traveled in. And a special thank you to the Estes Valley Library. Eric White is a tremendous librarian here. Organizes all sorts of amazing programs. This event is just a community-run forum, but Eric is just a total treasure for the city of Estes. Loves this town. This is an amazing library, and I think the perfect place to host a kind of a community conversation like this. So I'm going to just quickly talk to you about kind of how we got to this point of how this forum idea came to be. And then I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion. And you're probably going to hear a lot less from me over the course of the evening because we have some really incredible and knowledgeable folks here at the table in front of us. But this forum here is sort of my baby, my idea. And so I wanted to talk for just a second about why and how we came to be sitting in the library talking about moose on such a blustery, windy evening. As many of you, anybody with a pulse in Colorado has probably seen, an extraordinary amount of coverage and discussion and dialogue around moose lately for any number of reasons. Our population of moose is growing. There are, if you check, Facebook or, TV in Denver or whatever, it's been pretty common to see something about human moose conflict, right? People running into moose or, moose running on the loose through, insert town X here, right? Sometimes an amusing quote from Andy. But also here in Estes, right, there's a lot of discussion here, including the event last night, about the, conservation challenges around moose today and, some of the, wrangling around how do we manage these growing populations and what to do about it, right? This topic came to my attention. You must be wondering, why is there an archaeologist standing in front of you rambling here about moose? For me, this topic came to my attention here primarily through the news, right? In our discussion around these really important and complicated contemporary topics, it turns out that there's been a fair amount of intersection with my field of expertise and with our understanding of the past as well, right? And some of these things have emerged that were a little concerning to me, right? So in some of the media blitz around here, we have heard discussions around moose and a narrative around them being non-native. And it's oftentimes been paired with ideas here, that struck me as a little bit threatening, right? Or a little bit concerning here about, what the consequences of our language and our discourse about how do we identify an animal as native and what might this mean for what we're doing here today, right? So this is a question about the past that means something for the present. And in particular, it seemed to me like the basis for this argument was kind of anchored in our understanding of archaeology and of the past, right? So this is pulled from the Rocky Mountain National Park website from earlier this year, a sort of an appeal to authority that experts have concluded moose, were sort of not native here to the park. So, there were archaeological reports flagged into this, which is what brought it onto my radar and my attention. And for me, this was it's caused my spidey sense to go off. I got a little fussy. I tend to be fussy. I'll try not to be too fussy here tonight. I'm also pretty friendly. I'm a curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado Museum, and I know, we have collections that run pretty ancient that have identified moose in our, published reports. So to me, I started to, try to wrangle, perhaps there's something kind of misaligned between this idea of, moose as invasive when we think about the past, right? There are other things that happened though too that also triggered my spidey sense a bit that seemed wrong. And this is, I think that a fair amount of our public narratives here have absorbed ideas. Sorry for the panelists. If you need to get up and say, have I absorbed or perhaps just sort of unintentionally passed along ideas here about the role of moose in indigenous societies here in Colorado, right? And I'm always a little suspicious when I hear indigenous perspectives shared secondhand from folks that aren't indigenous themselves, right? And some of these, are kind of anecdotes or stories, like this was in the Smithsonian Magazine here. But if you Google, you can actually find things that are kind of crazy, really extraordinarily confident. And I don't put this at the feet of anyone in this room. I actually think this website is made by AI, God help us. But, quite confidently, repackaging ideas here about indigenous knowledge and archaeology and history and all these things together in a way that struck me as maybe not super well validated, right? And I'm suspicious and nervous about this because the, National Park Service and other folks have a pretty, I would say, checkered record on the, where does this lead when you start calling things invasive and non-native? And one of the founders of my discipline, which is called Archaeozoology, right, the scientific study of animals from the past, is a guy named Lee Lyman. He wrote a very, very sassy and even rude book in the late 90s, criticizing the way that archaeology and history was going into narratives about mountain goats being invasive in Olympic National Park. And here we are 20 years later, and we're on full-blown sort of eradication measures happening on this topic in a way that, gave the best of our discipline a fit, several decades ago. So I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist. I want to stay grounded in the facts here, but this is why I entered the ring with my sort of paper on this that I think stirred the pot quite a bit. You might have seen this article. We wrote it earlier in the year, and we tried to just sort of take a look at what the record says in maybe a more significant way on these different lines of evidence, primarily archaeology and history, right? And we found records here that spanned a pretty significant spate of Colorado that take us back to the earliest days of historic records, not just one or two observations here, but things that look to me, as an archaeologist or historian, like a pretty continual, trickle, at least, of observations, and ones that also include, females, that include young animals, that suggest to me that there's some stability or persistence to these populations. I can't, as an archaeologist, I can't tell you what this means about numbers, but, I found things in archives that are like, this man here in South Park, having just killed a moose and a calf here in South Park in 1912. And I also uncovered that the narrative on this topic seems to have shifted a fair amount in several decades. This is a funny little cartoon of, one of Andy's predecessors here, at the Colorado Parks Division of Wildlife at the time with the big Tom Selleck mustache, where you can see that at the time that moose were sort of intentionally translocated around the state for the first time, they thought that they were reintroducing moose, right? And they were leaning into the historic record. So I want to point out, and I'm not going to make a big deal about this, but I have sniffed out perhaps a small lack of transparency or dialogue on this issue. And I'm just going to point out my own personal experience here. We'll go back to this archaeological report that was sort of the foundation of our appeal to authority on the topic. It's an internal report, and I wrote my first sassy blog about this, almost, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I've been trying to find this report ever since, to very little avail. I finally tracked it down, though, in a very roundabout way, basically the day before we went to press on our recent paper. And it was only through my editor getting an email from the guy who wrote the report, right? And I, again, not going to go too much into this, but I strongly get the impression that many people were displeased with me getting access to this report and us putting it in our write-up of the topic, which I think is I think is a pretty major barrier to healthy, effective, open dialogue on this topic. So I am thrilled to welcome here tonight, like many of the real leading experts in different aspects of this. We've got folks that are talking about wildlife preservation, wildlife management. We've got folks that are really familiar with park management. We've got paleoecologists. We've got historians, environmental history, archaeology, and tribal historic preservation, all here in the same room, in a room full of members of the public here, and an opportunity for everybody to ask questions. And I think, you know, ideally, go out to dinner afterwards, build some conversations, some connections, and some dialogue that looks to me as a little bit more open and a little bit more healthy. So with that, I have selected the only person in the world, perhaps, I think, with the character, the connections, the trust, and skills to really navigate us through, which I can tell from the vibe in the room here, is a physically uncomfortable dialogue, right? And this person here happens to be one of the most accomplished academic thinkers about relationships between people and environments in the past. He also happens to be the director of the Center of, potentially soon, Center for, the American West at the University of Colorado. Somebody who's worked for many, many years in this corner of Colorado and understanding people, understanding animals, and our connection with them. He has literally written the book on the environmental history of the Kawanichi Valley, right, which is a relevant, major, important piece of this topic. But more than that, I think he's incredibly kind. He's incredibly thoughtful. And I think, you know, one of my true academic heroes. So it is, I have jotted down some notes here about everything wonderful to say about Dr. Andrews. One of the most wonderful things is he was born and raised in Boulder County and educated at world-leading institutions like Yale and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Maybe I should have said Yale second. Anyway, but his books have covered an extraordinary range of topics. His latest book was just submitted to the press here, talking about the great horse flu. So I am probably the first person to subscribe and pre-order almost any of his academic achievements. But he's also been a really, really thoughtful thinker on the topic of people and moose in this corner of the world. I think he's got the friendships and respect for all the perspectives that are going to be on display here tonight, including yours as members of the public. And it's a tremendous honor to welcome him here to moderate our conversation this evening. So please join me in a round of applause for Dr. Thomas Andrews, who will take it from here. Okay.
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't help but disappoint you after that. I have to have Will be my hype man and introduce me wherever I go now. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. You're way too kind. I will inevitably disappoint all of you after that kind of introduction. But it's really good to be here tonight. Thank you for braving the wind and all the other elements out there. It's not the friendliest night. Really excited to be here for this conversation. Excited to be here with all of our wonderful panelists who are physically present, as well as Crystal, who's patching in virtually. So what we're going to do then is I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves pretty quickly, give you kind of a sense of I guess we're going to kind of focus on what your credentials are, but more maybe like what you know about this topic or how you're engaging with this topic. And then I've got a set of questions that Will mostly drafted, and then I modified them, and we're going to kind of run through them and see what happens. You know, it would take all night if everybody weighed in on every question, and so I'm going to try to kind of do some triaging here and also try to make sure that everybody's getting a chance to air their perspectives. And we're going to run through all that for probably, I think, maybe till like 6:50, 6:55. We'll see what ground we cover. You all will have questions after all that, so we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions as well. Does that sound good?
So I'm John Wendt. I am a paleoecologist, and I just started a position as an assistant professor at New Mexico State University. I came to this topic by way of involvement with Will, and I wrote some of the articles that he posted up there and the preprint that we published recently. My paleoecological expertise is focused largely on reconstructing large herbivores over space and time and understanding their ecological interactions, how they respond to climate change, how they affect and interact with things like fire and vegetation and humans.
Very cool. I'm Andy Holland. I went to CSU for wildlife biology twice. Once wasn't enough. It took 2 times. I grew up in Montana. I started my career as the terrestrial wildlife biologist in Middle Park, which is the west side of the park and includes the Comanche Valley. So I do have a little bit of history. That was a long time ago, 20 years ago, but I have a little bit of history with what the vegetation looked like 20 years ago when we were talking about the same topic with browsing of elk and moose. And then I was the terrestrial biologist in Durango. And then I promoted to the statewide big game manager 15 years ago. So I've been in a statewide role. I work on most things related to management and research of big game in Colorado with Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
My name is David Cooper, and I work at Colorado State University. I'm a wetland and riparian ecologist, and I've done research in this park since the 1980s, so almost 40 years. A lot of my work has been on the west side of the park, in the Comanche Valley and many other areas. I'm an expertise in willow ecology, and I can answer questions about current and over the last 30 or 40 years of my observations of changes in the park and what may have caused them. For those of you who are interested, we published a paper this year in conservation biology. It's free and open to the public. You can download it if you want the whole story from our 30 years of collaboration.
Hello, my name is Chris Clatterbuck. I'm the Natural Resources Program Manager at Rocky Mountain National Park. That means I oversee things ranging from air quality to zoonotic diseases. And unfortunately, Will Dacey, who's our large mammal expert, couldn't be here tonight. So you're stuck with the junior varsity. I think they go to you, Dr. Andrews, to get a refund since Will couldn't be here. But I've worked for the Park Service now for 17 years, 5 years here at Rocky. I think I actually predate Dr. Cooper's work here in Rocky. Like many folks, this Rocky was our summer vacation spot. And so what we would do is we would drive around at dusk through Moraine Park and Horseshoe Park and record all the species we have. We still have those documents in a file cabinet in the basement of recording every elk and deer and marmot and pika that we were seeing on our trip. So happy to be here. Rocky has a very special place in my heart for sure.
Thank you. And Crystal, would you please introduce yourself? I think you're still muted, Crystal.
Oh, there you go. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. So those Nasitna, Crystal Seabearing, Tesena, Nanana, Hinana Ase, na Nase, Nanise Thena, Hinana Anana, Northern Apotipo, Nanana, Director, Nana Nanana Hise, The Rosie Sage Labo, Na Nesana, Nanana, Not Ne, Greg Labo, Nebesi Behet, Nanana, Nen Basaith, Joe Sage, Ne Behet, Nanana, Hinatse, Hazel Trosper Sage, Niatajana, Daintana, Haho, Nausa. So my name is Crystal Seabearing, and that's just my introducing myself of who I am. I'm the director for the Northern Arapaho Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and I've been there since 2017. When I introduce myself, I say where I'm from and who I'm from because it helps us identify like locations of where we come from. And so on my mom's Arapaho and my dad's Lakota. So on my Arapaho side, I come from the Sage family and the Trosper family. The Sage family is the one Sherman Sage who helped name the trails in Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park. That's my great-great-grandfather. On my Lakota side, it's from the Cheyenne River reservation now, where the reservation is now. That's where my family's from. So I've been born and raised on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. I grew up here. My family was really big on education and our water, our natural resources, our culture, language, revitalization. So I grew up with that, like trying to learn as much as I could. I went to the University of Wyoming and I got my degrees in history, American Indian Studies, and environment and natural resources. Between all that, because it took me a long time, I got married and I had 3 children in the process. So it took me a while to get those degrees. But I've been, working with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office for going on almost 9 years now. And I've started out as an archaeological technician and I worked my way up to the director position now. I've seen a lot of different facets and perspectives on management, park management, forest management. I've sat in a lot of consultations, a lot of, just different ideas and perspectives of not other tribes, but other regions, how other field offices work. It's all different. They all see things differently. And trying to get our perspective out there, is a challenge. But that's my role and duty as a TIPO, is to make sure like we're putting in our input, we're allowing consultation to happen. It's formal, it's meaningful. And that, the big goal of our office is access for our tribal members to reconnect to these areas. Our ancestral migratory territory covers 17 states, Colorado included. And this is based on creation stories, our migration stories, our oral histories, all our histories. They're out there, at these 17 states. And this was before, we had any borders, any states, state lines, anything like that. It was just the land. And so it's hard to put into context sometimes state boundaries because our stories cross over those, because they're so old. And so trying to get that understanding for us and getting our tribal members access. When I hear people say, I vacationed there in the summertime, our tribes did too, a long time ago, before we were forced on reservations. Those were our vacation spots too, at one time. Those were our hunting spots, those were our fishing spots. That's where we lived, that's where we had ceremonies, right in those areas that you live and you talk about. And that's my role is to reconnect our people to those places, to those areas. We've been disconnected from those areas for over 150 years. And so that's learning our language and our culture. Our words came from the area. Our Arapaho language is so descriptive. There's like 23 words for the word mountain, but a lot of them describe places in Colorado. And, it's descriptive, but I can go on and on, but that's it. So yeah, that's me. And thank you for allowing me to join. I have the virus that's going around, so I didn't want to spread it to anybody, so I'm home, but I still wanted to participate in this because I knew it was important. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Yeah, we appreciate you. I guess I don't need a double mic, do I? We appreciate you, still being here, and hope you feel better very, very soon. All right, well, I'm going to dig into the first question. So we're gonna start with just like a tiny little matter. So should moose be considered native or invasive to Colorado and the Southern Rockies? And anticipating one crucial dimension of this, perhaps sort of a corollary. What is meant by a breeding population when we're talking about this issue of whether this species should be considered native or indigenous? Sorry, whether it should be considered native or invasive. And I'm going to start this one off with Crystal, and then I'll see who in the room wants to jump in. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Crystal, but if you want to chime in on this one, you could get us started.
We have your slides up.
You're currently muted if you're.
So we have your slides up now too, I think.
Okay. I had to get permission to unmute again.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, this is my slide I kind of made just on a tribal perspective of moose. And like I said, there's we didn't have borders, or I didn't know we were crossing into Wyoming. Our people didn't know at one point in time. And so a lot of our stories, they're not really based on like specific locations, but they're more towards like the morality or the moral of the story, or what it's trying to teach you, or it's trying to explain describe a place of how to get there, based on like migration stories and things like that. Go ahead, next slide. So in a term of moose, the Arapaho name is Hinenihi. And so that means this descriptive, what it means is like it was like he's a big man. Like that moose was huge, and it was huge like a man. So that's what it's describing. But in our older words, like the older Arapaho word for it is Saini that, which means like he has a huge flat nose. And so that's an older word. And based on just the locality of them, it's hard to say, if they were originated in Colorado or not, but just based on the words, it feels like we saw them, quite frequently wherever we were. And like I said, our migration area was huge. So it's hard to say, but I'm pretty sure they were near the Colorado area. Okay, go ahead, next slide. This is just explaining, the symbols and art that we have, describing like our animals and our moose, and they're kind of descriptive in the way we put these symbols like on our beadwork, or like on our regalia, and it kind of tells a story of like who that person is, or like what happened to them in that time period, or if they're being honored or something like that. But these symbols usually are used in storytelling on certain items. One story that I heard from our Eagle Drum Society, which is a very respected old society that takes care of our drums, what they told us is that our drums were made of moose hide because of the durability in them. So they always, they used to have that made, and it was a big drum, and they took care of it, and that's what they used, was the moose hide for those drums. Okay, next slide. These are just trying to make sure like people understand, like, with the hunting part of it. We hunted a lot, whatever was there to help. And I think what a lot of people need to realize is like we did have a tribe, but we also had bands within those tribes and headsmen that took care of certain items and things that they needed. And so in the summertime, you know, Colorado was a huge place where we'd come together and have ceremonies, but in wintertime they would all split up. They'd all split apart and they would go to different places of the country. You know, some would go up north to get in certain medicines or certain things, and some would go south to get other things. And so they split up in those different directions that they needed to go. And so you know, they ran into a lot of these different animals in terms of hunting, you know, getting things for their teepee, getting items for their clothing, all of that. And so it's a shared um, history and story. But even today, like when I hear about the overpopulation of moose in Colorado, one thing that comes to my mind in terms of harvesting and hunting is our treaty rights. So, you know, our inherent right to hunt and fish is something, you know, that our tribal members really want, and they talk to me about this all the time, about being able to go to Colorado and to harvest, you know, elk or moose. And I did, you know, I when we did go into consultation with the park, um, uh, that was one of my questions was like how, if there's such an overpopulation, is there a way that the tribes could come in? And, you know, we were natural predators at one time too here. So like, why can't we come in and harvest moose for our people? And right now there's a big push for food sovereignty. And we do have a lot of people that are going towards more traditional diets and foods. There's programs here on the reservation that really promote that as well and have like farmer markets here, kind of the farm to table kind of setup. And so it's good to try to get our diabetes epidemic under control. And that's one of the ways that we've identified for us as Arapaho people is to um, go back to our traditional diets and our foods. And we just had like a few weeks ago from Montana, our tribe went up and they harvested 23 bison and they brought them back down here to the reservation. And we had to cut up and wrap all the meat up, but we were able right before Thanksgiving to give out all that meat to all our people, the elders, everything. And so it was good that we were able to do that. And so that's one of the things that I see in terms of this, you know, in terms of if it's native or not. But the fact of the matter is they're there now and they're overpopulated. But, you know, it for me, in terms of a tribal member, in order for me to help my people, I see that as an opportunity for us to you know, bring some of that food to our people who need it. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Who else wants to jump in on this one?
I'll make just
Andy?
a quick comment.
Okay, and then Chris.
I mean, I haven't thought about the definition of population for a lot of years. We focus on large, abundant populations when we're managing them, and one of the main things that we consider is the geographic boundary of a population and how it encompasses the summer and winter range, which I thought was very interesting. How Crystal was talking about migrating as humans migrating, and I would say just the basic definition in my mind would be a self-sustaining breeding population. And then I would also consider the geography. That's to your original question. I think a couple points that she made I found very interesting. One is the context that whatever moose were here or elk or whatever have been hunted for thousands of years by her people. And then finally, Crystal, I want to encourage you to engage in the bison topic. Bison just got dual classification in Colorado, so they're now both livestock if they're captive wildlife, and they're also big game wildlife if they're free ranging. And so I just wanted to bring that on your radar, Crystal. That's obviously off topic for tonight, but it's an emerging topic that's just happened in the last 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I'll just make one quick comment. Obviously, moose are native to North America. I mean, they wandered all over. They're very common in Canada. Certainly, they would have come down through Colorado and are native. The big difference between then and now is thousands of hunting people, thousands of grizzly bears, packs of wolves, lots of predators on moose and other animals. That's the giant difference that we really need to face.
Yeah, thanks. So these terms, invasive, non-native, not easy to define. To give you an example, we have a fringed sagebrush that we use in our restoration programs. It's great, it does great, it's a workhorse for us. It's a native, but if you talk to an agricultural rancher, they say that's an invasive plant because it is out competing our forage. And so it really, those terms can really vary based on your perspective. But I will say in terms of management, whether or not we call moose native or non-native doesn't really impact our management actions. So there isn't like this bifurcation of this animal is native, we must protect it, don't touch it. This animal is invasive, we must go out and eradicate it. So that's not how Park Service policy is. So we look at ecological processes and see, have they been knocked off their natural trajectory? Usually by things that we've done in the last 100 years, settlers, and as Dr. Cooper just talked about, extirpation of both native grizzlies and wolves, but then also excluding native peoples. And so when you have that system, that process is off, then we intervene. A perfect example is the elk and vegetation management plan. We can all agree that elk are native to Colorado, but at the same time, we had an overabundance of elk because of some of the factors that Dr. Cooper talked about, and that required then some intervention. And so we put up fences, we did some culling for 3 years, and that's a native animal, right? And so we're actively managing this native animal. Then on the flip side, if something's invasive, at the park we have about 1,000 vascular species of plants. 100 of them are non-native, right? We treat about 15. And that's because we look at what effect does this plant have on these ecological processes. Is it going to form a monoculture and drive out all these other plants and flowers, or will it persist in and amongst other biodiversity? And so, yeah, I guess native, not native, just to kind of deflate the room a little bit, that answer isn't going to have a profound effect on decisions that the park is going to make.
All right, looks like Will wants to weigh in on this one, and then we'll move to the next one. Oh, John as well. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a spicy one, so we don't get to any other questions. That's okay. I take your point on all these stuff perspectives, Chris. I do want to push back on some of these pieces, though. I think there's one piece in which this word native or non-native actually have some very serious ramifications. I mean, historically, the implications of an animal being non-native are that it should be removed, right? Ultimately, there is an implied threat, I believe, sort of tied in with that term, whether it's tied to a specific, agency and management plan, or just sort of a general sort of cultural milieu of like, this animal doesn't belong, right? And I think that has a wide-ranging, if difficult to pin down, ramifications. And I think it's important to know that the idea itself of an animal being native or invasive is kind of, in my view, it's grown out of living in a world in which, like, every single plant and animal, ecological dynamic in our world in Colorado has changed extraordinarily in 500 years. And a lot of the folks around here, you know, European settlers, were active parts in that. They would sort of track things along with them. They did some things intentionally, some things were unintentional, and we're sort of aware of how chaotic the results were and trying to get a handle on it, right? Oh, we brought this weed from Scotland. Now it's in every creek bottom in Colorado, right? Or, and this is where the word sort of was coined to sort of capture these continent or hemisphere scale translocations. But it's also being applied to things that look like century scale variations in animals that might have a, you know, millennia long history. And I think it's worth settling on the idea that we all recognize elk are native. Well, that may be true in 2025. It's not actually true in every context here in Colorado. And all you have to do is go to North Texas or certain corners of southern Colorado or California, and the idea that elk are invasive is an extraordinarily hot button political issue. Even though we recognize these are highly mobile animals that go up and down the plains and the prairies, and where we set that setting is sort of contingent upon our little bit of history. I would, you know, again, not trying to throw, you know, accusations here, but I would calibrate that most of our idea of what is native or invasive in Estes Park starts around, you know, 1907, right? Or whatever it was that people started paying careful attention to what the ecosystem looked like around here and writing it down, right? Not recognizing that in 1907, or whatever the, you know, founding date was, sorry, I'm not sure, but I assume it was in the early 20th century, that everything was in total disarray, right? And we might, even if it wasn't in disarray, animal like moose, you know, these are a somewhat kind of cold wetland adapted animal. Their movements almost certainly are going to fluctuate latitudinally, altitudinally with ecology over centuries and decades and patterns. If we take 200-year snapshot, we might capture some decades where there's a big reproducing active set of moose, and as the landscape changes, that situation changes. So I'm a little afraid that we've calibrated this concept for something that is really important, you know, to pay attention to, like this accidental or intentional disruption of environments based on what we are moving around as non-local, you know, European people. And we've accidentally trapped like regular dynamics here of animals that, you know, moose are invasive if we take, you know, the Pleistocene as our baseline for sure. You know, they replaced the Servalsi stag moose, and, you know, we should, you know, there are some folks that would like to rewild us to Pleistocene megafauna, but I think we need to be careful with these terms. I do think there's a very serious implication to that. In Park Service context, specifically on mountain goat here, I think there's been drastic negative effects that come out of this as a policy outcome over longer periods of time if we aren't careful about the language that we use. Now, if all that is being said and, like, you know, it doesn't make a difference, we're all in this together and we're recognize the moose have a place on the landscape, then I'm you know, I'll be the happiest person in the world if that's the scenario. But I have very serious concerns about the use of language and its ultimate outcomes that are derived from how I view this has played out in other cases in the United States in the last 30 years. So that's my spicy comment.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. You know, Will pointed out this tension between species that move around, that are dynamic, that are adapting to change, right? We know that we live in a changing world, and I think the management orientation should be a little bit more about, you know, anticipating and giving space for things to move around versus trying to maintain some idealized but somewhat fictional stable state, right? And also emphasize that the, you know, as academic as it feels, right? The category does matter legally too. It matters according to NEPA and the Endangered Species Act and Executive Order 13112 and National Park Service policy. You can look it up under section 4.4.1. And so, yeah, it does matter. And, you know, it's also interesting to look back at the moose thing with Rocky Mountain National Park has kind of been positioned as a continuation of the elk management plan, which was a collaborative. Well, they got community feedback in the early aughts. It became an adaptive management process, basically jargon for we observe the system, we collect baseline data, we implement management actions, we monitor those outcomes, and then we adjust our management actions in response to those outcomes, what we observe. I'll point out that, you know, when the whole thing was unfolding, and when you look at the EIS, the environmental impact statement for this proposed elk management actions, included choline and fencing, riparian systems. Moose were kind of on the side, right? And the monitoring program of the adaptive management plan was directed at tracking elk populations. It was following what willows were doing. This webinar last night pointed out that the park had to stop culling because actually the elk started migrating out of the park on their own. But the willows didn't recover except in the exclosures because, well, the connection was there between the moose, and that's why the park needs to now manage the moose populations, right? But there's a hazard here where when you're dealing with complex, dynamic, ever-changing ecosystems, that important variables are overlooked by a management process that necessarily needs to simplify, and you can't measure everything, right? So it's just something I think that needs to be part of this conversation going forward, is the simplifying effects of needing to make a system manageable. Also, back to the native question, natural conditions matter when they're discussing the elk stuff. So natural conditions, according to the document, the environmental impact statement, natural conditions are defined as the conditions of resources that would occur in the absence of human dominance over the landscape. Natural conditions occur when the components and processes of the natural system are intact. Natural change is recognized as an integral part of the functioning, and it goes on. But notice there's an emphasis on alteration by human activities. There's always been a tension with the National Park Service of what do we do with humans? I mean, humans have been in North America, in this part of the world, for thousands of years. We're trying to figure out actively how long, maybe 20,000 years or more. So if you want to go back to a condition where human dominance was not a thing, you'd have to go pretty far back.
Okay. Well, we got through one question. I'm gonna ask everybody to kind of run relatively, maybe a little bit more quickly through another one, and then open it up for audience questions. And various people have said things that maybe get into implications around this question, but let's just try to be as explicit as possible then. I mean, is the native invasive distinction important for how we manage moose today? What legal, practical, management, or social implications does the term carry? And maybe people could try to be precise in terms of where, within whose jurisdiction and vis-a-vis which people, and maybe in particular around the issues of human-moose conflict, as well as wetland vegetation management. Yeah, no.
I think we kind of covered this ground. We kind of did in the last question.
So I mean, you're saying that it really doesn't matter very much for management.
Yeah, we can go chapter and verse with management policies. you know, 4.1.5 covers this overabundance question and natural processes that have been adjusted, right? But again, from the Parker perspective, you know, we're seeing the same line that we said back in the 70s, that moose were on this landscape as itinerant animals, and we did not see in relatively short history a breeding population. But again, I guess part of why I'm here is to, again, deflate this tension that, or the supposition that we're going to go out and eradicate all of the moose because we're labeling them as invasive. And that's, we're just now starting a process, but that is not, again, in the cards.
What I see as a problem is a lag between when impacts from animals become very noticeable and degrade ecosystems and when management can actually act. And in this park, where I've worked for a long time, I mean, it's been decades and decades and decades of degradation. I can show you photographs from my history in this park. We could, if people want to see some photographs of, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, is the lag. You know, by the time you recognize there's a problem, if it's taken 20 years to start acting on it, wow, you've really lost a lot. Okay, so this is an accidental time series. If you turn off the lights, you could probably see it better, but I had graduate students working in the Comanche Valley in the 90s, and we used to have lunch on the same spot every time we were out there. And so I've been going back to the same spot for more than 30 years. And in the early 90s, I mean, there were tall, dense willows everywhere, lots of birds and beavers and frogs and all the whole thing. And just over this period of time, willows have been beaten down to basically they're extirpated functionally in this part of the valley. Moose eat the last year's stems, are the most valuable part of the willow. And last year's stems are where the seeds occur. That's where the catkins are developed, and that's where the seeds occur. So there's no seed rain anywhere in this valley anymore, except coming out of these little exclosures. So let's just run through a couple of quick slides. And yeah, so that's just an example of what it was like before, and that's what it's like today. And we call these kind of a beaver willow state and an elk moose grassland state. And it's just been such a switch ecologically. The valley basically has just completely dried up. Next slide. Yeah, here's an example. This was in 2010. This is a former student of mine, Kristen Kaczynski. She's a professor at California State University, Chico now. But in the background, you can see an exclosure that was built in the 1990s to study moose effects that's still standing today. The willows are very tall. By 2010, the willows had been stripped of all their leaves and living stems. They were about 3 or 4 feet tall. Today, we were just out at the site last week, and all these willows you can see in the foreground are now dead. Next slide. Just an example of changes in open water that have occurred in the Comanche Valley. These are all beaver dams, beaver ponds, and basically there's no water left in the Comanche Valley. I mean, it's gone. The only place you see water are in fens, peatlands. And that exclosure I showed you is this little dot right here. Can you see that? Okay, so if you follow that back in time, that was just part of the matrix of the valley, this giant willow complex. Next slide. And just an example of, 1920s, what it looked like, and today it's just, it's just so completely changed. So how do we get management to catch up to the impacts? I mean, that's kind of a gigantic issue. I think that's probably the slide.
Yeah.
All right. I just want to get back to the question, what does it mean? Because I think there are two things, this is kind of in part because of who's at the table and we're sitting in Estes Park. This has kind of become this Rocky Mountain fight. I think there are two pretty serious implications here for, what it means for how we interact with moose in the Southern Rockies, which is the focus of the forum, and Colorado specifically. One of these is, animals are extraordinary, at least from where I sit. Again, maybe this is more as just somebody who sits on my couch scrolling my phone than as a, professor at Colorado. I think everything is extremely political around animals in the state of Colorado. We have a very dynamic state. There's a lot of folks that are really invested in things like wildlife conservation. There's also a lot of hunters. There's a lot of recreational people, and there's a lot of agriculture. And all these folks have different relationships with wildlife on the landscape. And I think when you use the word non-native, it lathers people up to be, I mean, I've seen people list all of the, translocation events of moose that have occurred in Colorado in 40 or 50 years as almost like a list of ecological crimes, imposed upon us by parks and wild. I think it sows tension between hunters and people with other, relationships with the landscape. Moose are not a neutral animal. I often hear people say, "Oh my God, I was so terrified walking my dog. I ran into a moose." And like, if people start, Google, "Are moose native to Colorado?" and they get a certain response, they go down a certain pipeline in their relationship. And we are in a state in which, wildlife decisions are sometimes made by ballot initiative, right? We're in a social media era. And I think these are not just questions about wildlife decisions here in Estes Park. The other thing I would say is, I think, like, if we look at something like David has lined out here, which is like an extraordinary snapshot of a changing landscape that lines up with changing moose populations, like, it seems really, really logical, probably to everyone in this room, like, wow, there's like something needs to be done about managing moose populations. But I do think, going back to what Crystal said, if an animal is recognized as a native animal that's got millennia long record here, and part of the sustainable history here is connected with native folks, there might be a much stronger incentive to lean into, hey, maybe we're going to consult with, Northern Arapaho, or, the whole host of other folks that will be willing participants in managing the animals in a way that might look different in terms of the logistics of how it plays out. Maybe not to every framework, but I think in ways that still matter ecologically and socially. So I do think those pieces are important.
Okay, I want to see if Crystal has anything to say on that, and then I'm going to the audience in the room, and Will's going to check the chat, because I understand some questions have been popping up up there as well. But Crystal, do you want to weigh in on this one as well?
Yeah, I agree with everybody. Like, it's not really matter now if they're native or not. I mean, they're there, and moose management. It's really it's gonna come down to trying to you can't please everybody, but that's the goal when you come down to management and like how you're gonna handle them. But for me, on my side of it is just really looking at the ecology of it all. And when we introduced the bison back here on the reservation, and we brought 10 here to the reservation, um, and going out and feeding them, and checking on them. But I saw a change in the ecology just from those 10 being on the land. Of the elk came down, there was more birds around them, like they're like all the animals were coming to like look at them, and it caused this whole like ecological shift within that area that I noticed, just being there with them. And the same thing when I did the site visit the other last summer, up there, to look at the enclosure and see what the moose are doing, and all of that, and looking around, for me, from a tribal perspective, it's like, well, we can probably help with this if, we were able to come in and be a part of the management. They always talk about co-management, co-stewardship. What does that really mean? And what does it get down to? And so that's kind of how involved do you want the tribes to be? And I'm pretty sure, talking with other tribes about this issue, and we talk because we're at like the same consultations all over. And so we see each other often, and, just talking about this, we're like, yeah, like we want to help. We want to be a part of this and to address, the management of moose in Colorado. And so I hope that, we continue on that path. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. And Andy wanted to say something
Yeah.
relatively brief.
I have just a couple of figures that they actually, I think we're in line with what I was going to say. I guess I'll start with, I think it's appropriate that I'm sitting right here in the middle, and I feel like that was just, I think, random. I feel like I think it's important that I wanted to get at least out before we get into other questions from everybody, that Colorado Parks and Wildlife and myself as a big game manager, we are concerned about overbrowsing of sensitive willow and aspen communities. That is a big concern of ours, and we actively manage big game populations in the state with hunter harvest, specifically female harvest. We adjust population size with the female component of harvest, and I think we are attempting to manage moose within the capability of the habitat in all the populations in the state. And if there's a certain population that is over objective, we're seeing habitat concerns, or we're hearing habitat, we are going up in moose licenses, specific cows, and we are around Rocky Mountain National Park. So I guess I'm trying to frame this in a little larger context than just Rocky, because there's not hunting in Rocky. Just outside, we are actively managing moose and dramatically increasing moose licenses. And I don't know which slide you have. There we go. So there's the population estimate. And you can see it's starting to flatten a little bit. And one point I want to make is this is not all like in the northern Colorado original reintroduction area in the 70s and 80s. This is statewide. And so a lot of this is expansion of moose on their own as they pioneer habitats all the way to southern Colorado, and that's still happening. So a lot of this growth is South Park and Gunnison and all the way down to Durango now, Rio Grande, and that. It's not necessarily population growth here, but you can see it's starting to flatten. But the licensing, go back to that other one, the licensing is not. And the last point I'll make is that we have really high demand for these licenses. Last year we had 66,000 applicants for 667 licenses. So we could literally sell 67,000 moose licenses for 3,500 moose. Obviously, we'd eradicate moose in 1 year from the whole state. We're not going to do that. Obviously. But I think one of the narratives that I've seen in the press, and I've been interviewed a lot, I've been on NPR about this. One of the narratives that I try and make sure that I correct is that this is a problem that is in Colorado, is that we have no tools to deal with. And we absolutely have the tools to deal with it with female harvest. It's just getting the number right on any given year. And with that, I'll just stop there.
Super quick question. Are you currently co-managing? I mean, I know you're not co-managing with, you're not co-managing moose with Northern Arapaho. Are you with Southern Ute or Ute Mountain Ute or not at this
There's
point?
very few moose down there. There's moose in the Rio Grande, and
They're not coming up here.
I will say that the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute tribes have treaty rights to hunt moose in the Bruneau Treaty area, which includes the Rio Grande. So tribal members can hunt moose, and we co-manage them. They have the same harvest, mandatory harvest inspection process that we have, and they turn their data over from their tribal member harvest. But that's a really small piece of moose harvest in the state. But the short version is yes.
Okay. Thank you. I really want to get to the.
Thank you for that. I just felt like just to frame it a little bigger than just like the park.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you. So who has questions? Raise your hand up. Let me kind of get a sense. Okay. Well, that makes it easier.
I got a loud voice. This one's to David. I'm a retired biologist, worked with U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife, and I know the Comanche Valley very well, the moose over there. How much damage has been caused from that grand ditch built on the Never Summer Mountains? And then also the headwaters of the Colorado River has been modified. how much damage does that cause to the willows? Plus, we've been in a drought here in Colorado for what now, over 20 some years. And how much effect is that, you know, compared to, you know, we're not being told about?
Thank you.
We should
You're like Phil Donahue here. I should be like running. There.
Yeah, you should read our paper because we address those questions. So, you know, some of the flow of the Colorado is diverted, particularly the peak flow, but we've studied the effect of the Grand Ditch on the Kawanichi Valley, and it hasn't affected the water tables or the persistence of willows through time. So that's there. And, you know, the average flow of the Colorado River hasn't changed over the last 50 years. So even though we're in a supposed drought, it hasn't really affected things. And if the 2 points you have to remember is that there are exclosures out there. And if there was a drought and things were collapsing like they are outside of the exclosures, you would see it in the exclosures. But the willows in the exclosures are in fabulous condition. And the park has built more recent exclosures. Like in 2011, they built the Holsworth, the one at the Holsworth Ranch. And just over the last 15 years, the willows went from ankle high to 4 meters tall. There's beavers living in that exclosure now, and so they have recovered. So although the Kawanichi Valley is not hydrologically pristine, as you have mentioned, still there's enough water there for willow reproduction and persistence, for it to support all the different species groups that have been naturally occurring in the valley.
When you talk about management, when the moose come into the national park, how do you manage them? Do you cull them? What's your process? Do you shoo them out? I mean, or shoot them out? What do you do?
Yeah, and I'm going to build on that question as well, because elk would be a great example then, where population is one factor, but behavior is just as important. So my understanding of some of the effects that culling historically had was that it sometimes changed elk behavior as well. And so maybe this is not simply about population sizes, but also what sorts of behavioral shifts the Park Service can try to induce.
Yeah, so in terms of moose management in the park, really recommend, it's not up online yet, but last night we had a very informative webinar that basically says, here's the data that we have collected, here are the infrared flights, here are all the collars. It was very, all of this research. And now we go out to the public and ask for your guys' opinion. What do you think? We look to our policies. And so we don't have right now an action defined. But we certainly do not right now cull moose. The biggest management tool we have right now are those exclosures, is keeping them away from selected areas. I think that answers the question.
And what are the benefits and the limitations of exclosures as a management tool?
They're expensive, just to be honest, and also they will persist on the landscape for a couple decades, and you can't really fence out the entire park because, again, of feasibility of trying to get out into these areas. You don't want to create any more ecological or cultural resource damage when you construct these. But I think the big advantage is we still allow a gap underneath. So you have beavers and can access those. They have gates to allow people to come in, and that's where the best fishing and bird watching is inside those exclosures.
David?
So the one thing about exclosures is that they're in extreme treatment. I mean, they let no browsing occur in there at all, which is not a realistic management objective either. I mean, so you go from one extreme to the other, and there's nothing in between. So,
David, this is probably a question for you while you have the mic. This came up in the chat. I'm going to kind of modify a question from the chat. Why, and this is something that I don't have a good understanding of either. So Why does it seem that the moose impacts are so heavy in the Kawanichi Valley, but doesn't seem like there are other areas in the high country that are seeing similar?
There are.
There are,
Oh,
okay.
yeah. You
Okay,
go,
so the Kawanichi Valley is kind of like at the front end, and this is something we can expect elsewhere?
first place I started working in Rocky was in a big peatland called Big Meadows. So it's up the Green Mountain Trail on the west side. And Big Meadows was surrounded by willows on the edges, and those willows are gone.
Mhm.
So, I mean, any place you go, you'll see these impacts. You go to any
But is it just in the park? I mean,
in the park, right?
but outside the park, not a
Outside the
problem.
Park,
So is that
willows.
solely about hunting then, essentially?
I think it's about hunting, and I think if you saw some of the collar data that Will showed last night, some of these moose, they just stay in the park. They migrate around, and they've learned how to be in the park, and they're parkies. So, whether or not you can hunt those out by increasing hunting outside the park, I'm not sure.
John, you've been wanting to say something, and then I'll see if there's another audience question.
Sure. It's not, I'll consider it a continuation of my introduction. It's something that I should have said earlier. And also touches on the native question. So what I actually do is I look at lake sediment and I look at paleoecological proxies to look at ecosystem change over time. So we can look at pollen for vegetation, we can look at charcoal for fire. And some of my work has been developing biomolecular tools to trace herbivores. They poop out these distinctive molecules and we can measure them. So, and I just want people to be aware that this option now exists. As you know, park management, when they were thinking about elk, they considered natural range of variability an important thing to consider. And this also has potential, I think, to address some of the native versus non-native versus more, I think, more interesting, how dynamic were moose over time questions. So some of our colleagues also work on ancient DNA. It's another proxy that we can use to trace, to identify not only moose, but other animals, beavers, in lake sediments. Our colleagues have found moose in Grand Teton National Park, I think 5,000 years old DNA in the sediment there. So these are new methods for understanding ecosystem change over long periods of time, and it's not on a lot of people's radar yet. But if the park wants to, is interested in that kind of information, then that's something we could potentially work together with to provide.
Just to piggyback on John's comment, I think that's really important. I think like what I would love to see grow out of this conversation is like more curiosity about what other data sets might be out there. You know, we've got these interesting, snapshots just from a quick chat from Crystal that there might be, tribal perspectives that could be useful here that maybe haven't even been on folks' table. Engagement with let's cultivate a lake core record with some new paleoecological data sets that might be able to answer these deep time sort of timescales. The thing that's very troubling to me is this very hand-wavy treatment about the past, right? I think the idea that, it's just a couple of historic records. I would challenge you to take any animal other than maybe the dog or the cat and quantify in the newspaper records from 1880 to 1850 how many animals you get mentioned and try to turn it into a population estimate. That's just not how ancient data sets work. They're complicated. They're filtered through decades and centuries of chaos, right? Our newspaper records are just like maybe more of a measure of how many sort of European guys with a pickaxe were in a particular county at a particular time. It doesn't mean they don't have any information, but they're not straightforward quantitative metrics. And if we've got a newspaper record that goes back to 1859 and then stops, we can't say it tells us this or it doesn't tell us this. It doesn't tell us about the reproductive status. It doesn't tell us how many animals were here or there. We can make structured inferences, but they have to be built up cautiously and with way more curiosity about pulling all the different information that might be out on the landscape that hasn't been explored, right? So I think that's a totally unexplored opportunity here. We'd like to see folks lean into it more rather than just, sort of cut it off at the knees. But that's, yeah.
Okay, and
one quick comment. And I think Crystal Seabairn mentioned this, but just to make it explicit, you know, we take tribal consultation very seriously at the park. These are sovereign nations, and we negotiate, or not negotiate, I'm sorry, we do formal consultation as nation to nation. But those conversations, they are confidential, and so we don't go out and talk about how much we're talking to the tribes. And so we leave that up to, again, like Crystal, if she wants to disclose about those times that she came into the park and saw those disclosures, that's fine. That's not for me to promote. But just want you to know that this is a topic that we have been engaging the tribes on.
Okay, I think we have one last question.
Trying to put together some of the pieces here too. I definitely see on social media that and talking to people that so many people think that moose are not native. And that's really driving a lot of perceptions that people have about moose and moose management. And I appreciate the park wanting to involve people in the public in conversations about moose management, but I'm worried that if the majority of the public doesn't understand the complexity around moose, the public feedback is also going to be deleterious or harmful to the moose, because there's this overarching narrative in the public that moose are invasive. And so I don't know if there's an opportunity to pause and help people know that moose have a complex, long history here, and everyone has that same framework before engaging in some of these really tough conversations, so people aren't coming in with a bias already there.
I think that's a very insightful and very productive note on which to end. I mean, I truly do, because I mean, I think that that's probably what this has illustrated more than anything. I mean, because we were trying to wrap up at 7:15.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go until 7:30 if we need to. I mean, I want to make sure everyone at the panel get a chance to get into topics that they came prepared for. Or...
Why don't we do this? If you feel like leaving now, go ahead. Absolutely zero judgment. You know, you may have thought this was going to be a 60-minute conversation or a 70-minute conversation. If you want to shut down Zoom, shut down Zoom, and then we can have a conversation among people who are still. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, if you feel like leaving, go ahead, and if you don't, we can continue the conversation. Wow. Okay, everybody's going to stay.
Let's check with the panelists.
Crystal, do you want to say anything at this point?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversations of what we had and the different perspectives, and the Park Service, they are trying, to have tribes involved, and like I said, it's formal consultation, and a lot of times the public, and I run into this not only in Colorado but in other states as well, where organizations or other state governments or things like that want tribes to be involved in their cause or their purpose or their mission, I guess, towards a topic or a situation, where we have to explain as tribes, we're in a government to government consultate our status. So we understand the views and the perspectives of those organizations, or those political, entities, those towns, however they have it set up. But, on our level with the federal government, it's a lot different. And so it's hard to separate that. And we do handle like a lot of confidentiality within those meetings and what we do. But, I encourage, the community as well, that you should, be informed as well, because you're living there and you're being affected by these moose. And so, your voice is just as important. It's just on a different platform, but it's always good to have these dialogues and these tough conversations as well, to work through things, to find an actual plan that will work, for not only you guys as, citizens of, Colorado, but also for tribes as well to be involved in the moose management too, if they so choose. Um, and so I think this has been good. It's been good to hear like all the different pieces of it, in terms of the ecology, the history, native or non-native. There's opportunities, like Will said, like there's opportunities out there to kind of think outside the box. And if we really want to get down to these questions, and working with tribes or working with other entities to figure out, to answer that question about native, non-native, or other, ideas or theories that could help this situation. I'm, I'm not afraid to explore those with, people who are willing to do that. And so it's, we all have to live in this world. We all have to work together. The animals, everybody. And so, that's just the goal of trying to get everybody on one page, and letting their voices be heard. I think that's the thing in being transparent. So thank you for, tonight. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Crystal. We had a couple questions come up in the chat, which I'm just going to put out there. Again, you are now here at will. So one question was really about, I think there are questions that were really about kind of broader ecological dynamics and how moose fit into them. And so one was about whether wolves could be expected to play any role moving forward in managing moose numbers. Another question really centered on some of the well, I guess in the Kawanichi Valley, and specifically, to what extent are these really water problems more than they are over browsing problems? So maybe Andy, you could tackle the wolf element.
With that. I'm afraid I don't have a whole lot to inform that. It's to be determined. I mean, it all depends on how long it takes wolves to be well established, like in the context of Rocky again.
And from a position of, I'm ignorant on this. I mean, is there evidence of wolves predating moose in Colorado since wolf reintroduction?
I'm not aware of known predation on moose since
Okay.
the reintroduction. I will say that wolves are important predators of moose in Alaska and Canada, where there's no elk. Wolves definitely prefer to prey on elk rather than moose.
For obvious reasons.
Moose are much more dangerous animal to try and take down, and cow moose will much more aggressively defend her calf than a cow elk will. So the pack sizes needed to take down a moose are much larger than an elk. So the short answer is wolves will prefer elk as prey to moose. So I think we're a long ways out to answering that question, but I don't think that that's a solution to our current issue. I think it's going to take a while to answer that.
Okay, and then on the you want to?
I think we need to kind of wrap it here in.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know how much of a can of worms you want to open.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up now.
I mean,
okay. So we're gonna end things there. I think it was a really productive conversation coming from a bunch of different angles. I hope it's given everybody a lot to think about, and that it's sort of revealed a lot of the complexities, historical, cultural, ecological, political, that surround this issue. But the panelists will be around for a little bit, so if you have any questions you were too afraid to ask in front of everybody, please come up, and thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it.
one final note, I think we need a huge thank you to all of our panelists for traveling in to be here And a huge thank you to Estes Valley Library for allowing us to use this community space, and finally to Dr. Thomas Andrews for moderating this discussion. So in one collective round of applause, please express your thanks to everyone.